want to replicate I want to use risky assets to replicate the return on the risk-free asset. We come back and take a look at that idea a little later, where we talk about arbitrage-free pricing. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use stock A and stock B to clone a risk-free bond. Now, the new bond that I'm going to create is sometimes called, or the new asset that I'm going to create is sometimes called a synthetic security. A synthetic is like polyester, something that's created out of other fibers down here. So basically what you want to do is you want to use stock A and stock B to replicate a risk-free bond. Okay? Let's set up the synthetic portfolio down here. And the risk-free bond down here. And here we have the states. Okay, the two states that we have are state 1 and state 2, or good and bad, which are generic states, though the state itself, you shouldn't attach too much meaning to it. You can just call it state 1 and state 2, if you will. The return on the risk-free bond in state 1 of the world is, what's the value of the risk-free bond 1 year from today? 100, that's right, it's 100. What is the value of the risk-free bond if the bad state of the world occurs 1 year from now? 100, yeah, that's why it's called a risk-free bond, right? Its future value is constant, it's basically guaranteed by the government. Now what you want to do is this, you want to create a portfolio on the left-hand side that will mimic the behavior of the portfolio on the right-hand side. So you want to create something here that will be equal to the risk-free bond in state 1 of the world. You want to create something on the left-hand side that will be equal to the risk-free bond in state 2 of the world. All right? Now, what is the price of stock A if state 1 of the world occurs? $30, right? Should be 30, correct? Okay. So let's have 30 down here. And what I'm going to do is, you also have numbers of shares, right? So this is the price of stock A. I'm going to use QA to represent the quantity of stock A. You can think of that as basically being equal to shares of stock A, all right? Supposing state 1 of the world occurs, the good state occurs, what's the price of stock B? 18. And then, of course, we multiply this by the number of shares, which I'm going to call QB, quantity of stock B, all right? Now let's do the same thing for stage 2. In stage 2, the price of stock A is $10 multiplied by the number of shares or the quantity of shares of stock A plus $12 times quantity of B. You can immediately see that phrased in this fashion, it's quite obvious what it is that we are trying to do down here. The prices are given, the variable down here is the number of shares. So by picking the appropriate number of shares, you should be able to replicate the risk-free bond, but by using risky stocks like stock A and stock B down here. You can easily solve this. Simply multiply, for instance, the bottom number by 3. If you do that, you will find that QA is equal to how much? QA equals, go ahead and solve that, see what you come up with. value. QA should, if you solve this, QA should be equal to negative 3.33 and QB is equal to 11.11 shares. Here's the interpretation. In order to close the risk-free bond, we are creating a synthetic security made up of the following: 3.33 shares of stock A and 11.11 shares of stock B. Now what confused most of you was the negative sign down there, and the negative sign down there really represents a short position, and the positive sign for 11.11 represents long position. This is actually very conventional, and we are going to be using this convention pretty much for the rest of the course in option pricing theory. A negative sign is a short position. A plus sign is a long position. Okay. Now, short and long often confuses people, but there is a very simple interpretation of the negative sign and the positive sign. Simply think of the negative sign as being asking you to sell, and the positive sign as asking you to buy. Okay. So basically, the argument down here is telling you that in order to create this synthetic security, you need to sell 3.33 shares of stock A, and you need to buy 11.11 shares of stock B. Now, what will that actually do? Yeah.
You mean first borrow security A and then...
So let's not worry about the borrowing. I think that makes things more complicated. Let me do the actual transactions, and perhaps it will be clearer, rather than using terms like short and long down here. Okay, let's use it in a much more common sense kind of fashion. Buying and selling, something that everyone is familiar with. All right. So here's again what we have established so far. We have established that by selling 3.33 shares and buying 11.11 shares of stock B, you should be able to replicate the future value of the risk-free bond in state 1 and the future value of the risk-free bond in state 2. Now here is a fundamental theorem in finance. A very fundamental theorem in finance tells you that in an efficient arbitrage-free market, if the future value of portfolio 1 equals the future value of portfolio 2, then this will automatically imply that the present value of portfolio 1 will also be equal to the present value of portfolio 2. Sorry? This particular condition will hold if there are no arbitrage opportunities, meaning that there are no risk-free opportunities.
So if present value of portfolio 1 is equal to present value of portfolio 2, then this future value.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it will go back, the causality runs both ways, basically. All right. Should. Uh-huh.
Because I want to really understand something.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can you say that you quote A, then when you have A and 7?
No. Let's not. Hang on a minute. Okay, let's actually do the transactions. Let's not tie ourselves up in the shorting and the long position just as yet. Like I said, there's a very common sense interpretation of what's going on down here. All right. All right. So basically, we have established that in order to create the synthetic security, we need to sell 3.33 shares of stock A, and we need to buy 11.11 shares of stock B. Now let's do that transaction as follows.
Before you move on, it's just so that I understand
Uh-huh.
you get QA and QB.
Mhm.
You just subtract both of the equations, one from the other, set one equal to QB, and then plug it in back to one equal to
Well, perhaps the simplest way of doing it is multiply the bottom equation by 3 throughout. So,
Okay.
for instance, you'll get 30 QA plus 36 QB is equal to 300. 30 and 30 will cancel out, leaving you
Okay.
probably with 18 QB is equal to 200, and then you can solve for QB straight away from there.
Okay. All right, thank you.
We have to make much better.
Okay guys, let's do the cash flows involved in the synthetic portfolio. So let's do the transactions implied by the numbers down there, okay? Now let's not worry about the shorting and so on. Think of the negative sign as asking you to sell 3.33 shares of stock A. So in order to create this synthetic security, I need to sell 3.33 shares of stock A. Tell me, what's the price of stock A today, right now? Okay. So according to the result that we have ended up with, we need to sell 3.33 shares of stock A at $15. Now, let's think of this purely in terms of cash flows. If I sell 3.33 shares of stock A at $15, do I receive cash or am I paying out cash? I'm receiving cash, right? How much cash am I receiving? I'm receiving 3.33 multiplied by 15. If you take this out to 3.333, this is basically equal to 50. Now this is a potential source of confusion because you have a negative sign down here and you have a positive sign down here. But just think of it in purely common sense terms. When you sell 3.33 shares, you get money. Okay? So the cash flow implication is that you have a positive cash inflow. Now the second part of creating this clone security is that you are buying 11.11 shares of stock B. What's the price of stock B today? 12. Is this a cash inflow or outflow? What is the cash flow implication of the second transaction? Outflow, right? Because you are buying it. So when you buy it, 11.11 multiplied by 12 gives you a value of 3. That's right. This means that you are, in establishing this portfolio, you are out $83.33. Perhaps that's at cash flows of synthetic portfolio today. Guys, you might want to add this term in there, cash flows of synthetic portfolio today. Now let's do this 1 year later. Cash flows of synthetic portfolio at year end. I sold 3.33 shares. So at the end of the year, I need to reverse the transaction. So what do? I need to close out my position basically.